Hello, this is Zara Richter from the Facing Autonomy podcast. We have an excellent show for all of you today. The title of our show is Lumpenproletarian Foucault. As the basis of our show, we're talking to independent scholars, Violet Chrysanthemum and Tancrede Fulconis about their excellent piece, "The Spectre of Antifa," and then using the discussion of their piece to draw out an anarchist and communizer reading of many general topics, not but not limited to Foucault and his work. Uh, 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 you go ahead and kick us off, Sheer.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited about today's show. Just having a discussion with Tancrede and Violet before the show. This seems uh, it's really exciting. Just having an opportunity to discuss Foucault in the current epoch of like COVID-19 and the George Floyd rebellion and the mobilization that's taking place not just in the U.S. but around the globe in various forms. So, I'm just going to pass it over to Violet and Tancrede to introduce themselves and, begin this interesting discussion about where we're at and sort of, the legacy of Foucault in that sense.
Um, uh,
So,
Tancrede, do
t-
you want to go first?
Whatever you want.
Yeah, yeah, you go first. I'll go
Okay.
after you.
Thank you very much for having me here. Really happy to be here and to be speaking. So my name is Tancrede. I'm a PhD student at Goldsmiths working on structuralist and post-structuralist analysis of the Republican values in France. So specifically, what they do, which institutions produce them, and what affects are brought into being by these institutions. And so I've been looking at the Republican values through Foucault in many respects, especially through discourse, through the critique of institutions, and through normativity. I've also been looking at post-colonial theory and post-colonial reading of Foucault in many regards, in order to locate and situate the Republican values in France's colonial past. And so about the article, should we hold and talk about it after introductions?
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It's up to you two, I guess, Violet and Tancrede.
Yeah, I think we'll just go with the introduction for now. So,
Okay.
um, I'm Violet. I'm an independent uh, scholar from India. So, Uh, I have been influenced by Foucault's work for the last 3 years now, and it has kind of really shaped my view on politics as well as how the world works. I'm really looking forward to this discussion because I think, like, to a certain extent, I'm not really a certain extent, to a large extent, Foucault has been kind of co-opted by the academy, and much of the insurrectionary insights in his work have been kind of glossed over to kind of serve
Mm-hmm.
this academic cottage industry of governmentality studies, which don't really talk about civil war or things like illegalism. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
really looking forward to discussing that, and I think that stuff has been really important in what has drawn me to Foucault's work, as well as, like, even when I'm analyzing uh, political situations that are taking place in the world today. So I'm really looking forward to having this discussion.
That's an amazing introduction. Zara, you want to ask the first question, I guess, like, uh, or how Foucault sort of maybe about sort of your reading about Foucault and why you think this show is really important, I guess.
Uh, well, we I wanted to discuss the I want to start by just discussing the work of Violet and Tancrede on their
Mm-hmm.
article, the Spectre of Antifa,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
and see how that relates to our discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
uh, when you bring up the rhetoric of unruly elements in the protest, uh, that went on in the past summer. How much is this a reference to the Lumpenproletarian bodies that Foucault argues are at the center of formalized power in works such as the birth of the clinic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Tancrede, you want to go first again?
Sure, we can. If you want, we can do that, so we don't have the silences.
Yeah.
Okay. So what really interested us, I think, in the uprising specifically, is the discrepancy between the institutional capacities and the way in which organizers and activists and the thing that we call the NGO industrial complex talks about the protests in some attempt to reterritorialize the protest. That's actually the subtitle of the piece, and at the same time, I think it's for me it came from reading a cross reading of Fanon and Foucault. So Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth is talking about how the lumpen proletariat is the true revolutionary element, and that colonization and imperialism make the lumpen proletariat fight amongst itself, but then eventually in a lightning flash, as the George Floyd's uprising, there is a moment where the lumpen proletariat comes together and actually fights against imperialism, and in that way, it is specifically in that way that the lumpen proletariat escapes sort of the institutional determinations, and because it escapes the institutional determinations, and because it is labeled as delinquent and rejected and pushed on the margins of society, it is able to do such a thing as burning down a police station, because it escapes the conditioning, the sort of normality that power imposes on bodies. It's no longer restricted by the ways in which power freezes us. It's the ways in which power prevents us from acting. It's not conditioned by that, and therefore it has this ability to burn down a police station, to fight the cops in the streets, and to actually usher something that's terrifying to power, something that's not controllable and not necessarily something that power can recuperate and then play with.
Right. Um, I would just like to mention two things. One is that just to relate the our piece to some insights from Foucault. So there is a discussion from 1972 called "Confining Societies." It's a discussion between Foucault, Jacques Donzelot, and others whose names I don't remember. I think Virelio is in there as well. So uh, There's a very important remark that Foucault makes, which is that what capitalism has been afraid of since its birth is basically insurrection, the guys who take to the streets with their knives and guns and who are ready to battle. And it was very important for capitalism that capitalism, the bourgeoisie, has been haunted by the specter of insurrection. And it was important for the bourgeoisie to let the proletariat know that it was not in their interests to ally with what Foucault calls the plebs, which can be broadly read as the Lumpenproletariat. It was
Mm-hmm.
not in the interest of the proletariat to ally itself with the plebeian elements in the population, and the split between the plebs and the proles was kind of produced through courts, through police, through the education system, through the system of what we call what is a modern day NGO industrial complex, which is, I think, what's the term for it? Is it social welfare? I'm not sure, but it's
Mm-hmm.
precisely that. But that thing, that
Yeah.
as well. So it's through these institutions that the split has been reproduced. And it's very interesting because how Foucault's work with like the GIP, the Prison Information Group in France, begins with the repression of the Maoists after the gauche proletarian Maoists after the 68 upheaval. So after, when they are jailed, they start making these demands for like freedom for political prisoners, how they're political prisoners and they should be treated better than like common law prisoners. And like Foucault's first intervention is like to precisely get rid of this boundary between political prisoners and common law prisoners. And what he
Mm-hmm.
says with like, and what he says in his, I think this is the On Attica interview, the interview he does after his visit to the Attica prison after the uprising there. And what he says is like common law was also created by the bourgeoisie. And so you cannot distinguish between like common law prisoners and political prisoners. And like much of the work of the GIP, I think, was precisely to meant to like get rid of this split between what was considered like the prison population in France at the time was again something that traditional leftist analysis did not take into consideration. So it was meant to get rid of the split between what was like the proletarian element as well as like the plebeian element. So
Mm-hmm.
there's that. And I think that applies to today's protest pretty well, when where you have like this organized sector comprising of like groups who are led by like these NGOs, etc., who really uh, take part in this like ritualistic form of protests, which are like based around state recognition. And you have these other people, these other bodies which like deviate from this line all the time. And like these are the people who like bring out the insurrectionary potential in every revolt. And like the whole NGO industrial complex kind of it serves as like usual. I mean, this is not new. Like the entire basis of like this whole social welfare thing can be linked to the police. I mean, I would say it is a form of policing. So
Mm-hmm.
it's so it just starts to recuperate this by drawing hard lines between like the good protesters and the bad protesters. And
Mm-hmm.
I think there was also another aspect in which like Foucault was important to at least my understanding of the protests,
Mm-hmm.
which was that Foucault mentions that power is not like repressive, at least not in the first instance. Power is productive, so it works by producing its subjects. And this is
Mm-hmm.
again something I think the Invisible Committee draw upon in To Our Friends, when they mention
Mm-hmm.
how the anarchist is produced from the population as a separate figure upon which and like even the population is something that is produced by power as like this inert mass incapable of revolting, and the anarchist is produced as like this subject separate from this population. So like the anarchist can be cast as like the enemy of society, the internal enemy. And this is like just like kind of biopolitics 101, which is like society must be defended against its own internal enemies. So
Mhm.
yeah, so again, like the figure of the outside agitator, it was something that was produced through these discourses of like the media, as well as politicians, as well as like the whole NGO groups, the good citizen protesters, etc., etc. So yeah, I think like
Mhm.
that was like those were the insights like I drew from Foucault's work.
Yeah. Zara?
And that there's a tendency to place these post structuralist thinkers and to suggest that they have no relevance to the current moment, to the current movement. And you see this tendency from social scientists who want to use Foucault entirely for his theory of neoliberalism, to the post anarchists, the want to wax poetic on this theory of power as this relativistic, constantly altering, flowing kind of substance, who ignore the potential readings of these theorists as uh, directly, encouraging out and out revolt within the institutions of normate society. Uh, 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 for the next question, I want to ask about uh, how the history of madness relates to the current treatment of far left discourse in the wake of the uh, uh, nationalist turn in global politics.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I think about the history of madness. I think it's interesting to see um, how basically we have been constantly, I mean, through these protests, especially, there has been constantly a side that has taken the ground of reason. And so we have the NGOs, we have the organizers, we have the activists who have taken the ground of reason and who have been like, we are the reasonable people, we are making reasonable demands, and we are controlling the unreasonable elements of the
Mhm.
protests. And I think that's been a sort of constant recurring thing. And even I've read, I think we've all seen it. Articles about the cops basically arresting protesters in the middle of protests and organizers trying to facilitate arrests rather than help people resist arrests, and organizers that have basically tried to prevent protesters who are being attacked by the police from defending themselves. And I think that there have been this production of um, there has been a production of unruliness, of basically madness on the side of the protesters. The violent protesters, in quotes, have been painted as mad in a sense, and through their refusal to adhere to respect order, both on the side of the orderly protest and to respect order as the physical repression enacted by the police, they have basically been
Mhm.
rendered mad by the basically what I would call the alliance between the organizers and the police.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's kind of and building upon sort of the theme that Zara had been pushing at. I feel like the insurrectionary genealogy of Foucault is definitely not accepted within traditional confines of academia, Western academia, as such. And I wonder, you're talking also about, uh, you know, you know, how do we look at these tactics of control? And I think it's also in your piece where you're sort of talking about this sort of the tactics or techniques through which these protests are sort of, there's an attempt to control these protests and the rebellion itself. And for you, what have been the things we have learned from the protests and sort of the larger sort of resistance that rebellion that's taken place? And I think the terminology of insurrection and civil war is really important, and a lot of people in traditional leftist outfits, right, social democrat or those sort of things, they seem to be unwilling to understand uh, the vitality of these themes within Foucault's work.
Right. So, share. Let me just first say, great question. I love the way you phrased the question. So, I'd just like to begin by pointing out that numerous times in the 70s, throughout his interviews, Foucault is adamant, and like Zara just mentioned, how a lot of post anarchist theory reduces power to this free flowing substance. But Foucault is adamant that power is not a substance, that we have to understand power in terms of strategy, in terms of tactics, and that is precisely why he brings in the model of civil war, which he does for the first time in his punitive society lectures from 72 to 73. And then the theme is taken up again in Society Must Be Defended. Yeah, I think, sure, as you mentioned, like in academia, and I think like Andrew Culp has mentioned this in his piece Insurrectionary Foucault, that academia does not look at the war model at all, like uh, um, the traditional line that is pushed in academia is that Foucault replaced the war model with the governmentality model, but I don't think that actually checks out. Like, the governmentality model is meant to be a supplement to the war model, so it's not a replacement. And I think if you there is, however, like Foucault stops using the term war in the late 70s and early 80s. But like, I think, as Marcelo Hoffman, was it Marcelo Hoffman or was it Mark Kelly, I'm not sure, one of them have pointed out that what replaces war in Foucault's lexicon in his late period is games. So he just
Mhm.
replaces the bellicose imagery of war with something else. But it's still there. It's always there. Like, in Marcelo Hoffman's Foucault and Power book, which is actually pretty good and like tries to bring back focus on like the war model. He mentions an interview between Foucault and a Trotskyist group in 79 or 78, where he once again reiterates power in terms of war. So, uh, again, if we are understanding power in terms of war, then the entire struggle becomes about understanding strategies and tactics that are in play. And uh, my friend Nadine had this like fantastic description of Foucault's texts, which was like they are basically documents of counterinsurgency, explaining tactics of counterinsurgency and how we can like get past those tactics. And I think it's kind of precisely that, because like what is history of madness, which Zara just mentioned. Like the what history of madness kind of shows us is how fake the liberation that was delivered by Pinel, etc., and like this whole liberal narrative about madness was. And similarly, again with discipline and punish, I mean, illegalism is like a constant theme in Discipline and Punish, but it's kind of not really looked into. There was a pretty great article recently by Delio Vasquez called Illegalist Foucault, Criminal Foucault, that especially focused on the illegalist aspect in Discipline and Punish. So even in Discipline and Punish, we see that the unlike like this progressivist notion of history where we are replacing spectacular punishment with prison because prisons are more humane. Foucault shows us how like prisons were a more sophisticated form of control because precisely because the spectacular punishment of the sovereign could often go wrong because the power of the sovereign came across the power of the crowd, and the crowds would often like revolt against the punishment of the sovereign. So the prison was not like initiated by the reformers to be more humane. They were initiated because they were a more effect they were to like inaugurate a more effective economy of punishment that may have been like less brutal than torture, but it was also more continuous and spread out through the social body and much more effective in that sense in stamping out rebellion. And
Mhm.
it could again like what again in Discipline and Punish we see there is this theme of like popular illegalism, which was again in display all the time in when the crowds revolted against the punishment that was like against the sovereign's punishment. And there is this very interesting section on crime. So Foucault says that like initially uh, a lot of literature surrounding crime was like kind of like folklore. The criminal was often from a poor background, and like so the criminal became like this heroic folklore figure that the popular classes could rally behind. So this included like the lumpen elements as well as like the emerging proletariat. But then when crime fiction emerges as like this thing which shows that crime is an exclusive property of the propertied classes, of the bourgeoisie, of the rich, and it's not something that the poor should emulate. So crime becomes like this, like the criminal is rich and the one who solves the crime is also kind of, not from the popular classes if not rich. So this is like early crime fiction. So this again allows us to see crime fiction in terms of like strategy and tactics. And this is a really important thing, like seeing things in terms of strategy and tactics. And that is exactly how we can understand how things are recuperated and how we can get past those lines of recuperation. And Cher mentioned civil war, so I think civil war is like often misunderstood in uh, traditional leftist discussions because
Yeah.
civil war is reduced to this like extremely militarized binary conflict between two sides. But this is again a conception of civil war that does not actually hold up historically. And that is like in ancient Greece, what was described as civil war was precisely what disrupted the sanctity of the oikos, the home.
Mhm.
So the revolt of slaves, the revolt of women, these were described as acts of civil war. So the management, like oikonomia, the whole idea of the economy, the management of one's home, and the economy, the whole thing kind of derives from that. So civil war is not I mean if you there is actually a pretty great book on civil war. It's by Shasha Durakov. It's there on the Belly Research Institute site. So it looks into this history of the term, like
Mhm.
going back to ancient Greece and like how it applies to our modern day political conjuncture. So civil war is not really this binary conflict, but it runs throughout the social body. And like the appropriation of civil war into this like militarized binary conflict was the work of states, of modern states. So in the punitive society, Foucault points out like the whole Hobbesian theory of the state is based on like driving civil war to the outside as something that exists outside the social body and not within the social body, since the
Hmm.
idea is like that the social body is built on the contract. So there is no civil war over there. So the specter of civil war kind of constantly haunts the state. But at the same time, because it haunts the state, the reduction of civil war to this militarized binary conflict itself is like a tactic by states to kind of push civil war into a territory that is unwanted by people, so that people no longer see civil war in positive terms.
Yeah.
So that is again something that's very important. And like I'm sorry, I've been going on for too long. So
No,
as for
no.
as for
This is
the as for the
this is amazing. Uh, yeah, just keep on, keep on. I think like these are very crucial concepts, especially for our audience and just
Yeah,
the broader audience, because I think that uh, even our co-host Arturo, who has participated recently, wrote an article in Ill Will Editions trying to theorize the Civil War concept as well. And I think that there have been a lot of events now focusing on this concept, and I think that uh, the reemergence of this element within Foucault is probably uh, a very positive sort of move to our own understanding of the situation today.
yeah, and it allows us to basically not buy into the fiction of the state, that the social body is built on peace, that peace prevails normally, and then there are like these sudden eruptions of conflict. It allows us to understand that there is always conflict running through the social body, that what we call our modern nation states are not built on like peace or contracts, but are built on like this kind of fiction that there's it's built on conflict, obviously, because there are asymmetrical power relations, but it kind of codes that conflict through its ideas of peace and institutions, etc., and tries to sell us the idea that conflict does not exist, that the social body is one coherent entity that is like perfectly natural. But again, and this goes back to society must be defended, there's like this very amazing passage in Society Must Be Defended, where Foucault says that like no matter what philosophical juridical theory may tell us, war has not ended. Like society, like our modern states, civil society, etc., are actually built on war, and peace in its institutions, in its everyday institutions, etc., is actually waging a secret war. And it is this war that we must learn to see, that is being waged all over society. And what this does again is, I think it kind of entirely disrupts like the Hobbesian legitimacy of the state. And that, I think, is very important for like if you're looking for an anarchist reading of Foucault, that insight is like I think really important. And just to get into what Cher mentioned last, which was like where we see struggles heading. I'm really not sure, but it's very interesting because like a lot of things have happened and a lot of discussion is happening that is really interesting. Oh, right. I just wanted to mention one thing, which was like Zara mentioned history of madness and its relevance to our current struggles. And I think Tancrede has already mentioned like how the mad itself is a racialized subject that's produced through like certain strategies. Like what is seen as reasonable is something that is coextensive with like the political order of things, and in that sense the mad is entirely racialized by a political subject. But I also wanted to mention like this all this talk of police abolition that we have seen, we saw some people proposing like replacing the police with like mental health workers, and I think that's pretty terrible in its own way, because like as we know, like the traditional mental health, what's the term again, I'm forgetting, like the traditional I mean it our traditional conception of mental health, as well as like mental health institutions, also have like a very carceral genealogy. So I think their history of madness can be pretty effective if we remember like the what Pinel and the reformers brought about was not liberation for the mad, but like again another kind of like a different kind of chains from the ones that existed before. Yeah.
And I think that goes into the whole debate in Discipline and Punish about prison abolition and prison reform, where Foucault is talking about how prison reform is actually an integral part of the agenda of the prison, and that it's made to generate consent into the institution of the prison, and it's made to normalize and naturalize the institution of the prison. So I think we're going to see that a lot actually with in the coming years in the United States, where people are going to talk about prison reform, which are going to be token reforms, basically probably closing private prisons
Mhm.
and changing some structures of prison, but the core content is going to stay the same. And in the end, it's just going to be liberals patting themselves on the back, saying, "Oh, we have done it, we have reformed prison," but that's actually part of the prison industrial complex.
Yeah, yeah. This is excellent, and I think just having you two on the show gives us a chance to really have a good discussion around Foucault. Zara, do you have any questions?
Yes. We have seen a huge effort to distance the post structuralist tradition from the insurrectionary events of 1968 and of the earlier 20th century. Uh, uh, how is it possible for us to bring thinkers like Deleuze and Foucault back to a material relevance to on the ground conflict against the bourgeoisie of various forms?
I think it's a really good question, and I think it taps into the general sort of we have seen on the left with a lot of, including Marxists, who have tried to slander Foucault and Deleuze by saying that, oh, capitalism has basically claimed desire as its own, and then taken over a sort of Deleuzian analysis, and that Deleuze is now irrelevant suddenly because of how capitalism has and the Israeli defense forces have co-opted Deleuze. And I think it's an interesting. I mean, it's definitely an important question, and I think we really have to push a sort of more than a reading. We really have to push what Foucault and Deleuze's texts are talking about, and we have to. I think there are some privileged passages that have been sort of glorified in an academic context um, because they don't implicate a call to action, or they don't implicate a revolutionary tradition. Rather, they are just there are passages used for critique, but I think that critique distances itself from the real elements in Deleuze and Foucault that are the insurrectionary elements. And I think that we can definitely, we should definitely, I think that the critique of the critique and the revolutionary elements in Foucault and Deleuze have not been analyzed, or have not been pushed far enough. And I think that's precisely the problem, is that because they haven't been pushed far enough, that people stop at this sort of fence that prevents imagining a different future, or that stops possibilities, and so because they are not able to think beyond, they end up neutralizing things like Foucault and the works of Foucault and Deleuze. And I mean, even in Derrida, you can find a revolutionary tradition um, if you want to, and Derrida is significantly more liberal than Foucault and Deleuze.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I want to hone in on the point about Deleuze a little bit, because in Deleuze's book on Foucault, obviously a favorable reading of Foucault, uh, but I think there's something about you know what Deleuze is saying, that Foucault just doesn't problematize the state, the notion of power in the traditional Marxist as being possessed or owned in a form of property, but which is totalizing and reductive, or as an instrument or something like that. But it's also providing. It has strategic positionality to it, right? It also questions the party itself, right? The Revolutionary Party itself, in the context of that Cold War period, where we see in Europe, the French Communist Party, or the role of these social democratic parties, which, in Germany's case, killed Rosa, or in the Spanish Civil War, or those things. So I just wanted to like discuss that a bit. I know that Violet sort of discussed it a bit, but just like generally, what it means when we look at traditional communist politics and in the current epoch, or the current context.
Tancrede, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, sure. I think that there has been a sort of, in terms of traditional left politics, there have been a sort of mourning for orderly institutions, for top-down institutions, and for a sort of mourning of the father. I mean, we can see that in Mark Fisher. I think that would be my biggest critique of Mark Fisher, is that, and of Zizek as well, is that there is this sense of the left has killed the father, and now we don't have any authority, and therefore we don't have the authority to challenge capitalism. And I think it speaks, in a sense, I want to draw a parallel with how Foucault talks about how we have cut off the king's head, but that we have failed to kill the institutions that produce the king, and therefore the institution of sovereignty are still, in a sense, there without a king. And so we have, I know that Foucault draws a distinction between sovereignty and governmentality, but I don't think that Foucault forecloses the notion of sovereignty totally. And I think that there is still this cadaver of the king that's being worshipped without it existing. And in the same way, I think there is the cadaver of the father that's remaining over society, and that we have a leftist movement that is lamenting the death of the father, be it the death of the party, being the death of Stalin, being the death of a revolutionary figure that would guide us into a post-capitalist system. And I think that's where Foucault and Deleuze are extremely helpful, because they are basically criticizing the notion that there would be a revolutionary subject, that there would be such a thing as an individual that could train themselves to, in the right conditions, be a proper revolutionary subject, that we would then be able to police the boundaries of that subject, and then be like, everybody has to behave like this, and for us to have a revolution. And I think that precisely the institution of subjectivity is the ways in which the left has attempted to push a sort of revolution, the traditional left, that is. And it is also the very place where it has reinstated a sort of bourgeois and capitalist logic by reproducing these subjects that we need to have a pure worker, for example. But I think, again, Foucault talks about this when he's talking about the aesthetics of the USSR, that the worker as a class is actually modeled after the bourgeoisie. uh,
Hmm.
and so it's the mirror of the bourgeoisie, and but the real person, if I may say so, or the real individual, if we are going to use Deleuze's terminology, stands
Hmm.
outside of this mirror between the bourgeois and the other. Uh, it's the remainder. It's the difference. Um, and so I think that it's really that we need to actually push our desubjectification, and I think that's what the Invisible Committee and Tycon are talking about as well, is that the movements of desubjectifications, the line of flights, if we want to use again Deleuzean terminology, are the things that will actually end capitalism and that will finish the job of chopping the king's head, of chopping the father's head, uh, of deserting the institutions which actually reproduce our subjection and through our subjectification.
This is a really crucial point. I think if anyone wants to add on this, I think this is a really important point. I think like our listeners will really enjoy it
Yeah,
because yeah, sorry,
I
because
I
it has a
just
lot of implications.
yeah, I just want to add a few things to that. So um, yeah, so I'd like to bring this back to like my own context, like the Indian context, where like we have a traditional kind of Leninist left, which Zizek, etc. lament for. Uh, so what do I see with this left? Like in my own state, which is West Bengal, like the CPIM, which is the Communist Party of India Marxist, was in power
Yeah,
for like 35 years, and like it initially did some land reforms, which was good, but then like towards the end it was collaborating with like big corporate giants like Tata, etc., uh, to like clear out tribal lands, and
hmm,
like and then they massacred tribals, which they still refuse to acknowledge. Like it was state sanctioned terror, just to be able to create SEZs, which are like these special economic zones, where like the traditional labor laws don't apply. And like the whole logic was like, we are doing the tribals a favor by modernizing them, them into modernity, giving them work, etc., etc. Um, which is really a very, this is like basic colonizer logic. So but it's still very prevalent among the Leninists left, this whole progressivist notion of history, with like the worker as like this privileged subject, and the worker understood in a very traditional sense. So recently there were these protests over the CA and NRC, and I was working with a few leftists who were Leninists, and
yeah,
how the CA and NRC, the
yeah,
NRC is like the National Register of Citizens, the CA is Citizenship Amendment Act. So both of
yeah,
these things together were like meant to deprive Muslims of citizenship. So the National Register of Citizens basically requires you to go through this very bureaucratic procedure of like showing documents, etc., to prove you're an Indian citizen, which in
yeah,
a country like India, where like a majority of the population is extremely poor and don't really have such documentation, is like it's basically a tactic to cull certain elements from the population from having access to citizenship. And then the CAA was introduced as like this kind of band-aid, because when the BJP implemented the NRC in Assam, it turned out like, since this is a very bureaucratic procedure, the government itself bungled it up, and a lot of Hindus were left out of the NRC, so it kind of backfired. So they brought in the CAA thing. So the CAA is meant to give you citizenship as long as you are like Hindu, Sikh, Christian, Jain, Buddhist, etc., anything but a Muslim. So if you lose your citizenship through the NRC, you can just like go through the CAA and like get citizenship again. So anyway, just a little bit of context. So anyway, as we can see, this was pretty much a direct attack on Muslims. When I was working with leftists here, there was like this constant talk about going to the factory and how like only the working class can save us. And they had like the understanding of working class was basically the worker in the factory. So
Yeah.
it was, I would say, this is an understanding of working class that's not even based on any kind of class analysis. This is a cultural understanding of working class that
Mm.
has absolutely no basis in like material conditions. So
Yeah.
obviously there are a significant number of working class Muslims that they could have reached out to, but they didn't. So because like their entire idea of the working class is based in like this whole factory worker, this extremely traditional Leninist conception. So that was very frustrating because like I remember talking with them and asking if there were like if the at this point in time, like there were like there was like this intense repression of protests in Delhi, especially in this state called UP, Uttar Pradesh, by the police. And I remember talking to them and asking like if there is like this significant repression of Muslims, should we like wait for the factory workers to emerge from their sleep and try to like save them, or should we like do something and like organize with where like this kind of repression is taking place? And they were like, no, we cannot do anything, we must wait for like the factory workers to emerge as the subject of history. As- so
Yeah.
yeah, so like this I mean, I think with Deleuze, like especially his analysis of the party, what we see is like the traditional Leninist party itself is like an embryonic state apparatus, and it
Yeah.
simply kind of reproduces what it claims to oppose, which is something I think again anarchists have been saying for a long time. So it's
Mm.
just like the Deleuzian analysis kind of is done in terms of like desire, etc. So like how
Yeah.
the party is structured itself leads to like this kind of uh, uh,
Mhm.
this uh, this what is the term for it? And I mean, Guattari has this fantastic piece called "Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist," which is precisely about how like these forms of organization, these very hierarchical forms, these bureaucratic organizations, always facilitate kind of fascist becomings, as in a sense, like not
Yeah.
fascism in understood in a historical sense, but precisely an affinity for fascist desires. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I think what we see emerging now is like not a movement that is centered around a singular subject position, but
Yeah.
precisely around like but precisely it's a constellation of like multiple subjectivities which are all like kind of taking these lines of flight and kind of desubjectivating themselves from the apparatuses of control and like the apparatuses that reproduce our present, in a sense. So yeah.
Yeah. Zara, do you have any questions?
Uh, this has been an amazing discussion already. Thank you for this. What we see that those who have something, who gain something from that post-structuralist tradition and don't interpret it apolitically, have a different basis to act uh, instead on the organization of uh, those bodies who have been, repeatedly managed by the bourgeoisie, and whose management has been internalized itself as a mode of control. And so the policing of desire, the medical gaze, and his management of pathology, are just internal methods of internalization of this desire for of these fascistic desires as well. And so we see there that the internalization among protesters to police outside agitators, the internalization among voters to police, Russian agents or apolitical actors. There's an internalization of the need to management to manage within the center and the left liberal strata. And from in holding Foucault and Deleuze as useful figures while still acting on the left, we gain something that those Leninists who refuse to read such things just do not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead.
I think we gain also an insight in like I would advance that more that Foucault and Deleuze actually display a more materialist position than most Marxists would claim, and I think that there is really this idea of locating power in tactics, in strategy, in affect, and in institutions is actually a much more materialist analysis than the sort of general class analysis of power. And I think that it's also a place where, in a sense, the leftists who dismiss Foucault and Deleuze out of hand as non-materialists or as obscurantists or etc. are actually losing out on a lot of insights and on a lot of materialist analysis that they themselves fail to recognize as materialist, because it was undermined their entire conception of philosophy. And I think in general there is a pretty poor conception of philosophy on a lot of, at least, internet Marxists.
I mean, internet Marxists also have a very poor conception of what materialism means. It seems to me that they think materialism is whatever you can touch and see, like a very very vulgar conception of materialism.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, I think like all these points are really important. I had just out of I was just thinking about also what how do you view like Agamben in this context, in the context of Foucault, and the differences or sort of some of the writings about Agamben, because we are seeing, for example, like Idris Robinson's advancing his notion of civil war through Agamben, and I just think Agamben. I'm not sure. I may be wrong, but I think like there's a broader sort of you know disjoint politics or disjoint sort of uh, commons ideas and things like that. But Agamben also like sort of criticizes Foucault for not giving the law more agency, or the concept of state of exception or these things. How would you guys think about that?
Yeah, of course. I'm actually a scholar on the state of emergency, and
Mhm.
so I think that it's Foucault never talks explicitly about the state of emergency, but he already theorizes all law with regards to the state of emergency. And so,
Mhm.
in a sense, the state of emergency is sort of the fail-safe of the legal system. So, when the legal system fails to appear natural and eternal, it has to make the threat that threatens its aspect as natural and eternal, it has to destroy that threat. But it can't destroy that threat through normal legal means. And
Mhm.
therefore, it resorts to displays of power, it resorts uh,
Mhm.
to outstanding elements that are characterized as exceptional. But I think that the entire notion of the norm and the delinquent in Foucault is basically a state of emergency law metaphor that I think that Foucault actually completely takes the law into question but doesn't refer to the law in explicit terms because it's unnecessary. And I think
Yeah.
it's unnecessary because the law has been replaced by the norm, and even the law that we have in court is a norm. And so I think that there is this sense of I think Agamben on the state of emergency is I think the specificity of Engelman is that he's talking about refugees and he's talking about refugee law, and so I think that there is an important element in Agamben about their life and etc. that exists in the legal system, but that Agamben doesn't really address because he's really looking at something that is evidently exceptional. He's looking less at things that are implicitly exceptional, which I think Foucault is much more discussing, which is why I think Foucault's worth in terms of the relevance of exception to society as a whole is much deeper than Agamben, who is actually a scholar of exception, but whose analysis is more evident than Foucault's, if you see what I mean.
Right. So I just want to point out, like, as Tancrede said, that Foucault already theorizes the state of exception somewhat. This is actually, you can actually see this explicitly if you look up his interview with, like, Roger Paul Droit in 1975, where Foucault says that the law does not exist to prevent any kind of behavior, but exists to find loopholes within the law itself. So that is pretty much kind of like what the state of exception is, which is like the state of exception is something that is immanent to the law rather than something that is it's like kind of using the law to suspend the law kind of thing, which is precisely what he's saying, that the law is, if we understand the law in terms of tactics and strategies again, then he says like there are zones everywhere where the law is suspended. And again, uh, where the law is like, I mean, we can see this in real life when there are like fascist militias and the police don't do anything, and again zones where the law is applied, and again zones where like the law kind of coexists with a kind of criminal element that is kind of conductive to our society, like organized crime, etc. And that again goes back to what Foucault is arguing in Discipline and Punish, which is that organized crime was kind of like the neutralization of crime as this threat to class power, whereas like crime, what existed as crime before, which centered on this alliance between the plebeian elements and the proletarian elements, was a threat to class power. And how it responded was precisely by kind of appropriating crime and turning it into like this organized crime that exists now, which was like no longer a threat but something that was coextensive with the state and capital. So yeah, so oh yeah, Agamben, right? So Agamben, I just wanted to mention something that uh, since Cher brought up Agamben, which is like Tancred mentioned sovereignty earlier. So how Foucault talks about like that power is now located in these diffuse governmental apparatuses rather than in the central figure of the sovereign. So I think Agamben has done some really good work on this, like his book, the what was the name of the book? It's the one on the theological genealogy of the economy. Oh yeah, right, the kingdom and the glory. So Agamben basically talks about this, like if he agrees with Foucault that power is actually concentrated in these diffuse governmental apparatuses rather than in the central figure of the sovereign. But again, he says that like we see the figure of sovereignty still appearing, like the state kind of still maintains its unity, right? Even though it's even though power is kind of like diffused throughout the social body rather than in the central like institution, we still see the unity of the state manifesting itself. So how does it do this? And what Agamben kind of locates this in like the liturgical apparatus, which is like the apparatus of glory, and like how in I think this was in Christian societies, like um, there would be like these groups of people singing about the glory of God, and like this was basically the ritual of the acclamation. And then he talks about how like Carl Schmidt really praised these rituals of acclamation in like for Schmidt, a ritual of acclamation was like actually better demonstration of popular will than the institutions of representative democracy. And so we see for like fascist regimes how important these rituals of acclamations are. So like then Agamben says that in democracies, in our modern democracies, these rituals have not disappeared, but like they have been kind of secularized, which is an
Yeah.
argument he makes a lot. So uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so he
Uh,
locates
my,
the
I think,
liturgy.
yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah,
Sorry
just
for,
I'm almost done,
no.
I'm sorry. He locates this liturgical apparatus of like our modern democracies uh, in the media. So he says like the media is like this site of consensus building, public opinion. And where else but like precisely in this idea of public opinion do you see like this whole ritualistic reconstitution of sovereignty, especially because like in democracy, who is the sovereign in democracy? It's the people, right? And so it's precisely it's the people, but it's the people as a representative fiction, like not actual people, but the
Mhm,
representative fiction of the people. And that is
mhm,
why it's precisely in like this site of public opinion that the media kind of regulates, where sovereignty is reconstituted and the unity of the state is once again maintained. So just thought I'd mention that since you brought up Agamben and Tancrede mentioned like sovereignty.
yeah.
So
I have to
Yeah.
go. I'm really, really sorry. I'm teaching class, but
Oh, okay.
I have so much
Sorry.
more to say. I wish
Yeah.
we could do a round two.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll do a round two. Don't worry.
We
Okay.
should do a part two on this. I think definitely, soon we should, schedule a time for part two because I had a couple more questions, um, you know, uh, um, and I think like this discussion has been great. Zara, you want to say something? You haven't talked.
This has been a great discussion, and I'm really grateful for everyone for participating. This has been an episode of Facing Autonomy. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.
thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you so much.